The subway system of New York was a vast and intricate maze, a network of tunnels stretching beneath the city like veins. Millions of people relied on it daily, but few paid attention to the small, unsettling details, like the inexplicable cold drafts in closed stations, or the whispering echoes that seemed to speak words just beyond recognition. One such mystery had persisted for years, whispered in hushed voices among subway workers and regular commuters alike. It was a tale of a carriage that did not belong. It wasn't on the schedule, wasn't listed on any official route, and yet sometimes it appeared on the tracks like a specter. Some claimed it was carriage 713, though no such number existed in the current fleet. Others simply called it the Phantom Carriage. It was said to appear late at night, when the subway stations were nearly empty, the last passengers either dozing in their seats or rushing home under the flickering fluorescent lights. People who had seen it swore that it didn't look like the other carriages. It was old-fashioned, with a strange metallic sheen and dim, yellowed lights that barely illuminated the inside. But what made it truly terrifying was this: those who boarded it were never seen again. The rumors were dismissed by officials as urban legends, the kind of ghost stories people invent to add a little thrill to their dull commutes. But among late-night subway workers, those who had spent years working the tunnels, there were those who refused to discuss it altogether. Some had seen things, and they knew better. For most, the story was nothing more than an eerie tale, a legend to scare newcomers. But for Daniel Harper, a journalist with a taste for the macabre, it was an invitation. And one night, when he least expected it, he found himself inside the Phantom Carriage. The subway station was nearly deserted when Daniel Harper arrived. It was past midnight, the air thick with the stale scent of damp concrete and metal. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting long, shifting shadows on the tiled floor. Daniel had spent weeks researching the rumors about the Phantom Carriage. He had interviewed late-night subway workers, combed through decades of missing persons reports, and even found a handful of chilling accounts from those who claimed to have seen the mysterious train. Each story followed the same pattern. A train that wasn't listed on the schedule would arrive at the platform. It looked different, almost out of place, its metal dull, its windows obscured by grime. It never stopped for long. Those who stepped inside were never seen again. Daniel had dismissed much of it as urban legend, the kind of subway folklore that grew over time. But there were inconsistencies in the records, gaps in maintenance logs that couldn't be explained, footage from station cameras mysteriously missing from the nights the train allegedly appeared. Now, he was here, waiting, watching. The electronic display above the tracks showed the next scheduled train was still 15 minutes away. But Daniel had read enough accounts to know that if the Phantom Carriage were real, it wouldn't be on the schedule. He checked his watch. 12:27 a.m. A cold breeze stirred through the platform. Strange. There were no open doors, no trains approaching. And yet, he felt a shift in the air, as if something was moving just out of sight. Then, in the distance, he heard it. A train was coming, but it was silent. No metallic screeching, no rhythmic clatter of wheels against tracks. Just an eerie, muted vibration that hummed through the floor beneath him. The darkness of the tunnel thickened. The flickering lights above dimmed further, as if something massive and hollow was swallowing the air itself. Then it emerged. Daniel's breath hitched. The train looked wrong. It was an older model, unlike any subway carriage still in use today. The exterior was dull steel, covered in streaks of grime and rust, its windows clouded, making it impossible to see inside. The number on its side read 713, a number that shouldn't exist. It stopped in front of him with a heavy, groaning hiss, as if reluctant to open its doors. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the doors slid open. Daniel hesitated. The inside of the carriage was dimly lit by weak, flickering bulbs, casting long shadows across the empty seats. The air was heavy with the scent of stale iron and decay. Every rational instinct told him to stay on the platform, to take a photo, write his article, and leave. But something about the train called to him, a deep, unsettling pull, as if the darkness within the carriage was reaching outward, wrapping itself around him. Before he could stop himself, his foot crossed the threshold. The moment he stepped inside, the doors slammed shut behind him. The sound of the closing doors echoed like a gunshot. Daniel spun around, pressing his hands against the metal, searching for a way to reopen them. There was no button, no handle, no emergency release. His heart pounded. The train lurched forward, and through the grimy windows, Daniel watched as the platform vanished into darkness. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Subway cars were never this quiet. There should have been the usual hum of machinery, the rattling of the tracks, the distant buzz of an intercom. But there was nothing, only the faint, rhythmic vibration beneath his feet. Daniel turned, scanning the length of the carriage. It was empty, or at least it seemed empty. The seats were worn, the fabric torn in places, exposing stuffing that had turned yellow with age. The floor was covered in scuff marks, as if hundreds of shoes had walked these aisles, yet no passengers remained. Then he noticed something worse. The ads above the seats, they weren't modern. They looked like they were from decades ago, their colors faded, their slogans outdated. Cigarette advertisements, movie posters from the 1970s, warnings about subway safety featuring cartoonish figures from a bygone era. This train, it didn't belong here. The air felt heavier, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. A feeling of wrongness settled deep in his gut. Then, the lights flickered, and in the brief second of darkness, he saw them. Passengers. Rows of them, seated perfectly still, their heads turned toward him, their eyes hollow and sunken into shadow. The lights blinked back on. The seats were empty again. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath ragged. He wasn't alone. Something was here, and it was watching him. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears as he moved toward the window, trying to see where the train was going. But what lay outside wasn't the subway system. It was something else entirely. The tunnel had been replaced by an endless, shifting void. Shapes moved within it, dark, writhing figures pressing against the glass, as if trapped just beyond the surface. Their outlines twisted and convulsed, their forms indistinct, but unmistakably human. They clawed at the windows, their fingers leaving streaks of darkness, as if their very touch was erasing reality. Daniel stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. This train wasn't just off schedule. It was off the map of existence itself. Then, something moved at the far end of the carriage. A shadow, darker than the dim interior, shifting between the seats. It wasn't a passenger. It was something else entirely, and it was coming closer. The lights flickered again. This time they stayed off for a full 3 seconds. When they returned, the shadow was closer. Daniel's breath came in short, panicked gasps. His hands searched the walls for anything. An emergency brake, a way out, anything. Then he saw it. At the far end of the carriage, where the next train car should have been, was a door. But it wasn't the standard sliding subway door. It was an old wooden door, warped with age, its paint peeling away in strips. It looked out of place, as if it belonged to an entirely different reality. Daniel didn't care. It was his only way out. He ran. Behind him, the shadow moved faster. The air turned frigid, and the whispering began. Low, guttural voices speaking in a language Daniel couldn't understand, their words sinking into his mind like hooks in flesh. He reached the door and grasped the handle. It was ice cold. His fingers tightened around it. And then, the lights went out completely. The last thing Daniel heard before the darkness swallowed him was the sound of something breathing inches from his ear. Daniel Harper stood frozen, his fingers clenched around the ice-cold handle of the warped wooden door. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, the air around him thick and motionless, as if the very space he occupied had been stripped of time itself. The subway lights had gone out, and something was breathing in the dark. It was close. The sound was deep, ragged, inhuman. A slow inhale followed by a wheezing exhale, each breath reverberating in his skull. He couldn't see it, but he felt it, could sense its shape forming out of the abyss, standing just inches from his back. The whispering started again, voices layered upon voices, speaking in an ancient, guttural language that didn't belong to this world. They spilled into his mind, crawling through his thoughts like centipedes, leaving behind a gnawing hunger. He pulled at the door handle. It wouldn't budge. Something moved behind him, close enough that he could feel the air shift. Daniel twisted the handle with all his strength, fingers slipping against the worn brass. It was locked, and every desperate tug sent splinters of cold panic shooting through his veins. Then, a whisper slithered into his ear. It wasn't the same inhuman voice as before. It was familiar. It sounded like him, a perfect mocking echo of his own voice. There is no door. Daniel's body went cold. His pulse slammed against his ribs, his skin damp with sweat. The darkness around him thickened, and for a horrifying second, he felt hands, too many hands, brushing against his arms, his neck, his face. Then, a sound split through the silence, a low, shuddering groan, like metal being torn apart from the inside. The subway jerked violently, the floor beneath him tilting, as if the entire carriage was shifting dimensions. The force sent him staggering forward, slamming against the door. And then, the lights came back on. Daniel's breath hitched. The carriage was no longer empty. Rows of passengers sat in their seats, motionless, silent, their sunken eyes fixed on him. Their faces were pale, their skin stretched too tightly over their bones, their lips stitched shut with black thread. The air was thick with the scent of rot and something metallic, not quite blood, but close. Daniel's stomach twisted as he looked at them, really looked at them. They weren't just passengers. They were the missing. Every single person who had ever stepped inside this carriage and never stepped out. Their clothes were from different decades, their hair in styles long out of fashion. Some were dressed in old business suits from the 1960s, others in grimy uniforms, their name tags rusted over. They had all been swallowed by this place, and now they were watching him. Daniel backed away, his pulse hammering in his throat. His hands searched his pockets, fumbling for his phone, his camera. Anything to prove this was real, to document this, to fight this. But there was nothing in his pockets. Not his phone, not his wallet, not even the notepad he had carried everywhere. His belongings were gone, like he had never existed in the first place. The train lurched forward, faster this time. The windows were still wrong, revealing only that endless, writhing darkness. Shadows pressing against the glass, the outlines of twisted figures clawing to get inside. Or perhaps to get out. Daniel turned, his heart racing, searching for a way out. That was when he saw his reflection. It was staring back at him from the filthy subway window, but something was wrong. It wasn't copying his movements. Daniel lifted his right hand. The reflection didn't move. Instead, it smiled. A slow, unnatural grin stretching far too wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth. The reflection leaned forward, tilting its head. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, it whispered, "You were never supposed to leave." Daniel's blood ran cold. His reflection's hand pressed against the glass from the other side, its fingers leaving behind blackened smudges, like burn marks. And then, the glass shattered. 1,000 shards exploded outward, but instead of falling, they hung in the air, suspended like droplets of rain in slow motion. Daniel staggered backward as his reflection crawled out of the broken window, pulling itself into reality with grotesque, jerking movements, its body folding in ways a human body shouldn't. It stood before him, taller than him, its grin still stretching impossibly wide. And then, it reached for him. Daniel screamed. The train slammed to a halt. The force threw him forward, sending him crashing onto the grimy floor. The air was thick with the static, like the space around him was glitching, reality itself fracturing at the edges. And then, the doors opened, not just to another station, but to somewhere else entirely. Daniel crawled forward, his limbs shaking, his mind screaming at him to move, to run. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because he knew that if he did, if he saw what was behind him, he would never leave. With the last of his strength, he threw himself through the doors, and the moment he hit the ground, the train vanished. Daniel woke up on the subway platform, gasping for air. He scrambled to his feet, heart slamming against his ribs, his entire body trembling. The station was empty, eerily silent except for the distant hum of an approaching train. A normal train. A train that belonged. For a long moment, he stood there, trying to convince himself it was over. Then he reached into his pocket, and his blood went cold, because in his palm was a small, rusted subway token, one that hadn't been in circulation for over 50 years. And in its surface, he could see a reflection, not his own, but the thing that had smiled at him in the glass. Its lips curled, whispering, "See you soon." The subway lights flickered, and in the distance, the sound of an approaching train rumbled once more. The phantom carriage was coming back, and this time, it wasn't leaving without him.